Today we have the owner and founder of Shining Stars Support Services. معانا رانيا النهارده. We're so happy to have you with us today, and welcome to Canada, your new home.
Thank you so much to Agnes for the opportunity to chat today and help support the families that are new to Canada.
Thank you so much for being here. And the first question today we're going to take from your great experience in helping kids here at schools and helping the new families too. So we're going to ask you about autism. And as a teacher, we noticed like increase in the number of the kids who are identified like autistic kids. So what is autism?
So thank you so much for your question and for having me here, first of all, to discuss obviously my experiences and my knowledge around autism spectrum disorder. But no, I have to preface by saying that I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not a clinician, so if additional information is needed or oversight from a medical doctor is needed, then certainly that is a welcome opportunity for the families. So autism spectrum disorder, or more formally known as ASD, describes a cluster of complex brain disorders. So these disorders are characterized by challenges in social communication, social play and behavior, and repetitive and ritualistic behavior. Autism spectrum disorder also includes what's known as autistic disorder, Rett's disorder, Asperger's syndrome. Although people with autism spectrum disorder sometimes on occasion have what we call a comorbid or secondary disorder, which could be characterized by an intellectual disability. However, we do know that many of those with autism spectrum disorder have extraordinary abilities, particularly in arts, in what we call visual performance, their ability to complete puzzles, their ability to recall information. And some of them, about 40% of them, will have above average intelligence, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and their ability to see the world in different ways. We do know that the number has definitely increased of autism. The ratio, 1 in 55 children now will be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder as early as 18 months. And so a doctor can provide that diagnosis.
Okay, that was our next question. Like, when can I notice, like as a parent, what are the symptoms that I can say, if my kid is having a problem?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. So we often talk about a triad of impairment. So you'll often see sort of like almost like a Venn diagram. So 1 circle, 2 circle, 3 circle, and all the circles are interacting. And in each of the circles or each of the sections of impairments, the first one is trouble with communication and social interaction. An example of this is a child may not be able to respond to their name, may not demonstrate emotions. So when they hit their head, they may not be able to demonstrate emotions. They may not be able to have a reciprocal back and forth conversation. They may not have interests or share interests in other children or initiate any social interaction. So you generally see a 2 to 4-year-old will engage with other children, may imitate the other children's behavior. For example, if I was to bring a box of Timbits into a room and I had some early learners, young children, and I said, sit down, everybody sit down, then most of the children would sit down. If someone had autism spectrum disorder or potential diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, we wouldn't see that child sitting down. We would see the child moving away, not following instructions, etc. So that's one sign of a potential diagnosis of autism. Also, it includes nonverbal cues. So, for instance, if I'm, looking at something, or if I'm gazing at something and I say, "Give me that one," or "Go over there," or I'm just looking at something, then the child understands what I'm looking to and will respond with that nonverbal cue. They may have difficulties with body language, understanding body language, facial expressions, or gestures. For instance, if my hands are crossed like this, or I've got a frown face, or I'm happy, they may not know how to reciprocate that emotion. So that's the first potential sign of autism. And that includes difficulties maintaining relationships that are appropriate to the developmental level and includes difficulties with imaginative play. So if I've got a group of kids and they're pretending that the carpet is water, and they're each, they've got their characters and they're flying their characters over, and they're making vocalizations, engaging in verbal behavior, making sure that their characters don't fall into the water, and if they do fall into the water, eliciting a yell or a scream or what have you. Children with autism generally will not engage in that same level of interest in other children. So they may have an absence of making and maintaining friends because of the lack of interest in other people. The other potential sign of autism spectrum disorder is what we call repetitive and ritualistic behavior. So we often define that as stereotypy, stereotypical or self-stimulatory behavior. And that can include sort of a number of different challenges. It can include repeating speech over and over, humming, focusing on specific patterns of behavior. So I had a student we were working with who was obsessed with dryer lint. So the lint that you take out of the dryer, and he could not be around it. If he was in a field of things that looked like lint, like those flowers that you blow, it was very much interfering. So the repetitive and ritualistic behavior, is there such a fixation that it interferes with the ability to respond, the ability to interact, etc. And it could also include a heightened response to sensory stimulation or sensory objects, like an indifference to hot and cold. For instance, if I give a child something that's really hot, they'll quickly respond by moving their hand away, whereas someone with autism will be able to hold it or will be indifferent to that hot or cold. Going outside and putting their feet in the snow, an indifference to that. It could also include excessive smelling or touching of items. And that's where you notice that it interferes with feeding, for instance, right? Obviously, I'm always going to say that if you have questions or concerns around any of these possible signs that your child may be exhibiting, to reach out to a psychologist or medical doctor or developmental pediatrician who would be available to officially diagnose your child. But if you're concerned that maybe they're demonstrating, frequently demonstrating the inability to respond to their name, or frequently demonstrating, lining up of toys, or hand flapping, or other sensory behaviors, then certainly to make sure that you want to rule out autism spectrum disorder.
Thank you so much for and for the details that you gave us and the examples, because sometimes as new parents and we having our first kid in the family, we say, oh, he's shy or she's shy, it's just a matter of time, and sometimes we ignore the problem or we don't want to admit the problem, and sometimes this delay the help that the kids may receive and the services that the school may provide. This will lead us to the second question, which is what are the services that are available at the schools here in Ontario to serve the kids with disabilities?
That is, I'm just going to pedal back to something you said to end this. It's really important that if you have questions or concerns, or you feel like there's something abnormal or not quite there, with regards to your child, that you access a diagnosis.
At the observation time, how long does it take?
So the observation, are you referring to the assessment to end this?
For the doctor, to give the diagnosis.
So generally it's a single visit diagnosis. There's a form that the doctor goes through from direct observation and timed observation. It's called an ADOX assessment, and it really goes through, what's the child's level of communication, like nonverbal communication? What's the level of social behavior and social play? What's the level of repetitive and ritualistic behavior like? So generally a diagnosis can be made on a single visit. And a diagnosis is really a ticket into service, meaning it is a label, it is a diagnosis, it's likely lifelong. Autism doesn't necessarily go away. You can reduce some of the symptoms attached to autism, but it really is an opportunity to access services and supports for your child. So at the school level, once a diagnosis is made, then it will go through what we call an in-school review committee meeting at the school level. And it will also go at the board level, depending on what board you're allocated to. It will go to a placement review committee meeting. The diagnosis will be shared with a group of specialists, including coordinating principals, speech language pathologists, psychologists, etc. Once that diagnosis is available, then they will get access to what we call itinerant teacher. So an itinerant teacher would really help support the school. They would consult with the family. They would provide supports as needed. They would also have access to speech language therapy. Now, speech language therapy at the school level is very different than private speech language therapy. What speech language therapy would entail would be more consultative. So it would allow the school-based team to receive support from around language or pre-linguistics, etc., from a speech language pathologist. You would also have access to an occupational therapist if needed. It's really an opportunity to have what we call interdisciplinary services and supports. That's at the school level. On a community-based level, you would have access to funding through the Ministry of Community, Social and Social Services, and I'm happy to provide the link. It's the Children with Special Needs branch. And you would have to obviously provide that diagnostic letter from the medical doctor, and then the child would be able to have access to what we call the Ontario Autism Program. And that provides funding to the families to hire an ABA therapist, applied behavioral analysis, speech language, occupational therapy, particularly for families that are new to the country. It is a very costly venture, and having that access to that financial support would be so needed. So you can have wraparound services in the community, including like ABA therapy, funding, and then you can also have wraparound services at the school level as well. So really a benefit to having that autism diagnosis for sure, and receiving those early intervention or intervention level supports at a time period that is most ideal.
Like a kindergarten level, and how long does the service, last with the kid?
Okay, so for the school-based services, the services last from the time that they receive the diagnosis all the way until the end of their educational career, like beyond high school. Okay, it may look a little different. The capacity and scope of support may look a little different, particularly when they're in the secondary level, when they're in the high school level, for instance. But those services are available at the school level until they finish their educational path. At the community level, it really depends on what the ministry and the provincial government decides to do with autism funding. It varies year to year, but with an autism diagnosis, regardless of when it is, the parents or the child will have access to funding. The funding could vary. So you can have more funding if the child is 0 to 6, and maybe less funding if the child is above the age of 6. But all of those questions can be answered by the Ontario Autism Program personnel.
Just a clarification about the school level and the community level. Does this mean that we have two types of services?
It's sort of an opportunity to create like an intersection of services for sure. And that's the hope, that the community service provider will communicate with the school, and the school will communicate with the community service provider. However, the school is obviously, with COVID, it's put a monkey wrench into things, and there certainly isn't the same level of having that community personnel go into the school because of COVID. But there are Shining Star Support Services, for instance, the organization that I'm the owner and founder of. We are allowed to go into the daycare and provide those services, but they're not separate entities. For sure, there's a lot of collaboration that happens among them, between them. And that's the way it should be, for sure.
Intellectual disability, I believe.
Oh, intellectual disability. Okay, if questions around a diagnosis, then they can bring that child up to what we call an in-school review committee, where the psychologist at the school level could dig a little deeper to determine if truly he fits the profile of an intellectual disability. Now, intellectual disability must be diagnosed after meeting the child. It is not possible to provide an intellectual disability diagnosis or even autism spectrum disorder without having met the child. So I'm wondering if that was the case. I wonder if this is a situation that this parent has gone through, that the person that was providing the diagnosis perhaps didn't meet the child. I don't know. I mean, I would be happy to connect with the parent. I can leave my contact information, and parents are more than welcome to connect with me.
Okay, this is awesome. Thank you so much, Rania.
You're welcome.
Would you like to give us the differences between the ADHD and the autism? Like, these terms are common nowadays. So
yeah. So ADHD, there's two types of attention disorders. There's ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So it's an attention disorder with hyperactivity. And then there's attention deficit disorder. So I'll talk a little bit about ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is a medical condition that must be diagnosed by a psychologist or medical doctor or developmental pediatrician. And this is not, I mean, often what happens, sometimes what happens, not often, but sometimes what happens is a child could have an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis and have a secondary diagnosis of ADHD or ADD. So sometimes we do see that happening. A person with ADHD has differences in brain development and their brain activity that affect attention, the ability to sit still, and self-control. And ADHD can affect the relationships and a child in the school, at home, and with friendships. Now, all kids struggle to attend sometimes, or follow directions, or sit still, or wait their turn. And this is not definitive of ADHD, but if you notice that the hyperactivity is interfering and make these struggles of sitting still, focusing and attending, listening, waiting more frequent and intense, then a medical diagnosis is needed. So generally we see 1, 2, or 3, or all 3 of these categories. We see inattention, we see hyperactivity, and we see impulsivity. So inattention, kids are easily distracted. Okay, they may have trouble focusing their attention, concentrating, staying on task. They may not listen well to instructions. They may miss important details or may not finish what they start. More importantly, they may daydream or dawdle too much. They may seem absent-minded or forgetful, and they may lose track of their things. So I'll give you an example. I have a client who I work with who've been supporting since 2017, since he's been in grade 4, and now he's in grade 8. And when we're working with him, what often happens is he'll look away, he'll look in a different direction, he'll start smiling and laughing. He has an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, but he also has ADHD. So it's almost like you have to bring him back. He may start daydreaming, his mind may go to things that are not contextual or not part of what's happening. Hyperactivity, so restlessness, the need to move, trouble sitting still or staying quiet, making careless mistakes, roughhousing when they shouldn't, acting in ways that may disrupt others. So this same client that I'm talking about that has ADHD, when he was coming into our clinic, he would have that there would be this car, and he was, at the time he was 10 or 11, he would push the car into other children, like keep pushing it into other children. So a lot of that roughhousing that may not be typical or without reason. Impulsivity, also acting really quickly, often interrupting, finding it hard to wait, doing things without permission, taking things that aren't theirs, acting in ways that are risky, or having emotional reactions that are too intense for the situation. Again, I want to always say it's normal for kids to be distractible, restless, impatient, or impulsive. It doesn't always mean with these things that the child has ADHD, and self-control develops little by little as children grow. Kids will learn, obviously, from their parents, will learn what we model. But for some kids, the settling down, paying attention may be hard and begin to cause problems, or with relationships at school. So that's when, if parents have questions or concerns, then a diagnosis, seeking out a diagnosis, whether or not it is or isn't may be appropriate.
For our culture, Rania, sometimes we are like very shy to accept, like that, or my child has a problem. So what's your advice for us as parents?
So that's always tough, and we understand how important our the expectations and the success of our children are, and we hope that our children will be sometimes better than us, right? In that way, like career-wise, educational-wise, socially, emotionally. But we always say that any diagnosis is not a stop to that success. I mean, we've seen many children and many adults with autism spectrum disorder. I know a number. I mean, I could discuss a number of different adults that I've seen have had a diagnosis of autism that hasn't stopped them in any way from achieving success. And again, success is not a one-size-fits-all, so we can't really compartmentalize success. If a parent is going through the motions of rejecting or negating a possible diagnosis, then allowing them to go through that process, allowing them to go through that grieving, allowing them to go through the emotions around that rejection, and then perhaps asking questions around, well, what is it that you see are hindrances to a diagnosis, or what do you see as the reasons why perhaps you wouldn't want to receive more information? So really drilling deep and finding out what is it specifically about a diagnosis that could is hard for you.
With the global awareness we have at schools,
but Autism Awareness Month is an opportunity to really highlight your child's successes and who your child is, and there's a variety of different channels that promote that. It depends on the school board that they are with. I mean, we have teachers at the board level that provide community supports for families. Okay, so that would be an opportunity once per month to get on Zoom or get on Teams and attend a collaborative event, whether it be getting to know your child, determining what community supports are available, where to get further diagnoses if needed, additional supports, etc. So that's available through the itinerant teacher. So the best bet would be to access those supports through your child's teacher or itinerant teacher. And that would be found, the name of the itinerant teacher will be found on the front of the child's individual education plan.
With the isolation, with the kids with autism, of course, COVID, has a great effect on everybody, especially on our children. Do you have any advices for parents who have autistic kids?
So for a parent, speaking from a parent's perspective as well, I think the most important thing is if you have questions or concerns or you're not sure the direction to go, to end this, I can leave my contact information. I'm the owner of Shining Star Support Services for persons with autism spectrum disorder. So if additional information is needed, just not from a professional to parent perspective, but rather a parent to parent perspective, I'm happy to provide that. That those set of ears if needed. I think sometimes parents are looking for that support. They're not looking for somebody to necessarily diagnose, or they're not looking for somebody to label their child. Rather, they're saying, here's what I'm experiencing. Where do I go? What do I do? So I'm able to provide that in my contact information if you need. The support is out there. Know that it's not a hindrance to your child's success. Know that your child can't overcome.
Amazing. You want to talk to us about the organization?
Yeah, so obviously more information can be found at www.shiningstarsupport.com, or if you Google Shining Stars Support Services, you can provide all the information you need. So we provide different levels of support. We provide in-center or in-clinic therapy. We provide in-home ABA therapy. ABA stands for Applied Behavioral Analysis. It's a therapy that's been around for over 50 years, and it really helps to make those behavioral changes, help teach adaptive skills, school readiness skills, etc. So that's available through Shining Stars. We also provide speech language therapy in clinic and in home. and we also provide occupational therapy as well. So obviously all the information that parents need can be found on our website, shiningstarsupport.com.
Rania, we're so proud of all your services that you provide for the community and for our children. Thank you so much for everything you do. Thank you for your time today and all the advices that you gave us as parents and newcomers. Thank you so much for everything. It was a pleasure meeting you today.
It was a pleasure seeing you too, to end this. You take care, and I'm happy to provide any answers or address any additional concerns from families if they have.
For sure. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
You're welcome. You as well.